This conversion and this rise of industrial capitalism from 1780 onwards was, in Marx's view, a crucial transformation.
The worker is related to the product of labor as to an alien object. The more the worker spends himself, the more powerful becomes the alien world of objects which he creates. The poorer he himself, his inner world, becomes. Karl Marx.
This iPad worker, who asked for his identity to be hidden, has been given a camera to film his life outside the factory. Once, these workers were peasants, with a connection to the land and its products. Now they're part of an assembly line. Alienation, argued Marx, is built into the manufacturing process of commodities.
翘首以盼，就是等待一种车过来，等待一种回家的一种场景。我有时我也会想到，我说自己从家里打工坐着那种，也是跟这种就是火车吧，也是跟这是一样的，3万元的一种车，来到广东。也就是说是车把你载到那个地方，你就是。
To Marx, it's the idea of living labour, which is so crucial, which distinguishes him very much from the classical political economists who saw labour as a fact of production. They call it a factor of production. It's a thing which gets put into production and then produces something. For Marx, it's not. It's a process. I used to teach introductory geography class, and the first lesson I would say, can you tell me where your breakfast came from today?
Come on, Bernie. Time for breakfast. Tony Tiger said.
People would say, well, I went to the cafeteria. And I say, okay, well, where did it come from? Well, I went to the supermarket. Oh, where did it come from? Where did it come from? Where did it come from? After a little while, I get them to go back and start to think about the person cutting sugar cane in the Dominican Republic, and that sugar gets on your breakfast table, and you have a relationship with that person who is cutting the sugar cane. But the market doesn't tell you anything about that. It disguises all of that.
A lush countryside in India hides what Marx saw as another characteristic of market's expansion: the transformation more and more of life into commodities. This group of cotton growers banded together to fight the invasion of their fields by genetically modified seeds.
Seed in India has been recognized as the source of life. And the very word bija, ja is life. Every ritual is about keeping seed forever.
Those seeds have now been genetically engineered and made into a commodity which farmers are encouraged to buy annually with the promise of higher yield.
Biotechnology, answering the world's call for a better future, today.
For some of these women, the new promise of the commodity of seeds turned into a nightmare. Genetically engineered seeds, which needed to be purchased every year, pushed their husbands into debt.
So they always borrow. They get the seed on credit. Now, the creditors take collateral in terms of the land mortgage. So 2 years later, when a farmer cannot pay back, the new money lender, who is the agent of the seed and chemical companies, comes and says your land is today mine.
वावर पीके नहीं और मतलब बच्चे को भी तबीयत बराबर नहीं रहती थी उसका भी वो कर्जा बहुत हो गया था खेत पर खेत पिकता नहीं था उसने औषधि ले लिया
कितना कर्जा आपको नहीं बोला ना कभी
नहीं संगेस नहीं दे
They don't tell their wives the seed has got us into debt. When they get into debt, they are ashamed. When they know they're losing their land, they're shocked because the bond with the land is still vital for a peasant culture. That's the day a farmer will drink pesticide to end their lives. And the figure has now hit 260,000 suicides. It is the greed of capital accumulation that has turned seed into something that has to be bought every year, that has been turned into a commodity, a consumer product, and the combination of new sources of profit for corporations.
I think that the idea of life as a commodity, really, it's interesting because is a cow a commodity or a pig? I would say they've been commodities for a very long time, and we don't really care about that. So where do we draw the line? And the line may be in human beings. I think what we really worry about is human beings.
And we as a society might have already crossed this line.
Her announcement made headlines around the world. Angelina Jolie underwent a double mastectomy after a genetic test showed she had a mutated BRCA1 gene, giving her an 87% chance of getting breast cancer. Her news put this company, Myriad Genetics, front and center. It has patents on the BRCA1 and 2 genes.
Once life is transformed into a commodity, it is subject to market laws. Investments in genes like those in seeds need to be protected by patent, keeping competition away.
In the system we have in this country and the investment system we have, which many people do think are the reason why we have been the leader for so long in so many areas, that's just the way it works.
So the production of commodities, according to Marx, not only transforms life, it changes our perceptions of nature and of ourselves.
Marx's theory of social change, again, is a process that says ideas have to change, but if the production process doesn't change, then the ideas don't mean anything. The production process can change, but if the ideas don't change, it doesn't mean anything. So it's the relationship between the production process and the ideas and the social relations and the institutional arrangements, and daily life has to change.
The World Congress on Industrial Biotechnology and Bioprocessing, the world's largest industrial biotechnology event.
The fetish of commodities, according to Marx, masks their role in impacting social change. Barely 60 years ago, scientific innovations were rarely patented and never industrialized in such a way.
1955, a year of anxiety and triumph. A major medical hurdle was crossed with the discovery by Dr. Jonas Salk of the anti-polio vaccine, which was to spread
60 years ago, no one talked about patenting the polio vaccine or selling it for a fee.
Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?
I mean, I can think back to a time when we had ideas, crazy ideas now, about social solidarities. We're all individuals now, and that's what neoliberalism changed.
The 60s caught capitalism completely off guard. How were companies to sell products to a generation that had rejected consumerism? The answer was to tune into the movement and to sell to the individual in everyone. The strategy worked. The marketing machine captured the spirit of 60s individualism and made it its own.
So Marx has what I call a co-evolutionary theory of social change. And to the degree that capital is a permanently revolutionary configuration, so we would see movements in ideas, movements in social relations.
Leaving ideology behind, we now derive a sense of personal identity and empowerment from the goods we purchase and consume. Go on, break the rules, define who you are. With our sneakers.
By the time you get towards the end of Capital, Marx does something interesting. He comes back to the idea of fetishism. And the big fetish is, of course, the money form and the credit system.
Do you have money jitters? Ask the obliging Bank of America for a jar of soothing instant money, M-O-N-E-Y, in the form of a convenient personal loan. Available now at Bank of America.
In order to expand tomorrow's demand and increase profits, today's production needs to be financed.
That means the credit system has to come in here. And what you can derive from this immediately is that the accumulation of capital in the history has always been paralleled by an accumulation of debt. You cannot have one without the other.
A large portion of this money, capital, is always necessarily purely fictitious. That is, title value, just as paper. Karl Marx, Das Kapital.
One of the things that Marx did, I think, very neatly was to demonstrate fundamental and foundational underlying relations. And that underlying relation between the accumulation of debt and the accumulation of capital can be looked at in a number of very specific ways. I'll give you one example. Tract housing is being built. Where do the builders get the money to do it? They borrow money from a financial institution and say, give me the money and I will buy the land and I will build the housing. Okay? And then there'll be a rate of return on that and I'll pay you back. Now, in order for that to happen, they have to be able to sell the housing to somebody. Buyers out there, they go to the same financial institution and say, lend me some money to buy the house that you have financed the production of. This is fictitious capital at work, because the financial institution that has surplus money is actually funding both the production and the consumption of the housing. Right now, we are in a crisis where fictitious capital is all over the place. But what Marx does is this brilliant thing of saying, there's a surface appearance which is the fetish, I'm going to go behind it and actually be able to describe to you the nature of this fetish, which creates this thing called fictitious capital.
Adrian Sobaru could be described as a victim of fictitious capital, a victim of debt which was never his. His story begins here in the Romanian parliament on December 23rd, 2011.
Romania's parliament canceled a no-confidence vote on Thursday after Romanian electricians staged a one-man protest.
C'était une journée assez particulière parce qu'il y avait une réunion importante du Parlement et on s'attendait à ce qu'il y ait des attaques politiques entre les hommes politiques, le pouvoir et l'opposition. Et puis à un moment donné, nous étions tous dans la rédaction et nous avons entendu une collègue qui a fait « Ah, il s'est jeté !»
Doamnelor și domnilor senatori și deputați, distinși colegi, membri ai guvernului.
Et là, il y a eu des bruits un peu bizarres à la télé parce que même les télés qui transmettaient en continu ne s'attendaient pas à ça. On a entendu des bruits, on a vu des images, on ne comprenait pas quoi, on ne savait pas qui s'était jeté, pourquoi, qu'est-ce qui s'était passé.
Urgent, vă rog, urgent, asistență medicală pentru
On his t-shirt he wrote, "You have gunned us down. You have killed our children's future. You can take away our money and our lives, but not our freedom."
Dimineața aceea, pe la 3-4 dimineața, m-am trezit din somn și am făcut tricou. Gestul meu nu avea niciun efect fără tricou acela. Știu doar că în momentul în care am zis să fac protestul, înainte să deschid nasul de la cămașă, fiindcă, practic, nu te certai cu o persoană. Te certai, practic, îți puneai în spate un sistem care te anulează în orice secundă.
From this tiny apartment in Bucharest, Adrian Sobaru and his wife raised 2 kids on his small salary of a public TV technician. After 2011, his salary was cut by 25%, and so was the financial help for special education for Callan, their autistic son.
Nu e ca o nebunie, deci exact în momentul respectiv cu protestul, a fost protest. Ceea ce s-a întâmplat după aceea și așa nu a venit de la el, dar chiar dacă s-a întâmplat ce s-a întâmplat, nu-i pare rău. Adică poate așa a trezit ceva în cei din jurul lui. Tot speră să tot...
How and why did the debt of his country lead to Adrian Sobaru's desperate act?
That was shocking to all Romanians, I presume. But because this is my way of thinking, I framed that episode, tragic episode, into a much wider frame. For many years, I thought about the way the financial industry has gone, or a derailed high finance and what was not going well. We realized that a growth model based on free movement of capital, total financial liberalization, and overborrowing by the private sector create fragility and create a vulnerability for the economy as a whole that may be very, very painful when when a crisis occurs.
In Romania, foreign capital in search of return flooded Romanian banks, which fueled growth based on debt.
The bankers stepped in and they helped the consumer growing, and money were flooding into the country. A lot of foreign savings flooding into Romania via banking channels, and they reached the Romanian consumers, and everybody could afford buying new things like cars and houses. And then that people thought that, we have reached the market economy and we can afford more. But actually, there were too much expectation and maybe some false expectations.
Romania, now the latest European country wrestling with violent protests over budget cuts and financial issues.
The bubble finally burst here, as everywhere. Debt, as Marx foresaw, is a form of fictitious capital. As a public employee, Adrian was never part of the boom. But when the bubble burst, the state turned against its weakest citizens.
Capital is perpetually moving its crisis tendencies around. If you look at the most recent crisis, it started in the housing market.
If deputies Alan Mathias and Derek Steverson come to your door, your house no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the bank.
It then went to financial institutions.
There's blood in the streets, and no one knows when the bleeding stops.
It then became state debt. It's now being pushed onto the people. But people are not in a position very frequently to bear that, so it's now moving back to financial institutions in some instances. Marx is, I think, very good at giving us a sense of how this moves around. And as it moves around, of course, it engages in a process of destruction.
On the far end of the global trail of the tsunami of fictitious capital in search of return is India, one of the world's largest emerging markets.
The term emerging markets emerges in the late 1980s, early 90s as well. And it's actually coined by people at the World Bank and the IMF in order to describe those economies which are going to be growing very rapidly. Now, why are they so concerned about growth? Not just because they believe that growth will address poverty, but they are interested above all in the quantitative measure of growth. What's the reason for that? If you examine deep enough, you find that if the real economy, instead of 5% per annum, let's say GDP in these areas is growing at 8 or 9%, the returns to financial investors in financial markets actually grow by orders of magnitude greater. So India in 2009 was third most lucrative stock market. The Bombay Stock Exchange was actually yielding annual returns of, on average, about 48%, which is remarkable. So what you actually notice is that India has become an outpost of global finance capital.
Finance capital, which Marx called fictitious, is said to have lifted around 200 million people up to the middle class, but left behind an estimated 800 million more, surviving on $1 a day.
Je pense que le monde dans lequel on est en ce début du XXIe siècle ressemble beaucoup au monde qu'observe Marx au XIXe siècle. Il y a un vrai souci par rapport aux inégalités de son temps dont les économistes d'aujourd'hui feraient bien de s'inspirer. C'est-à-dire que ce qui alimente quand même l'inquiétude marxiste, et plus généralement les mouvements communistes et socialistes qui se développent dans la deuxième partie du XIXe siècle, c'est la très grande stagnation salariale.
Stagnation so severe that in the United States, for example, a CEO was making 20 times more than his employees in the 1950s. In 2000, his salary ballooned to 120 times. And in 2013, it almost doubled again to 204.
Donc, on se retrouve aujourd'hui au XXIe siècle avec une réalité qui était en fait celle du XIXe siècle et des siècles précédents, à savoir une croissance structurellement lente, un rendement du capital structurellement plus élevé que la croissance. Et contrairement à ce que pensait Marx, ça ne va pas se résoudre tout seul. C'est-à-dire qu'il ne va pas y avoir une fin naturelle à ce processus par le simple fait de force économique. Ce processus peut continuer indéfiniment.